Of Crystal Nix-Hines to be the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise called UNESCO. And I wanted to speak on this nomination to once again express my firm opposition to the administration's stated intention to circumvent U.S. law that was passed by this body regarding funding of UNESCO, an intention repeated by Ms. Nix-Hines at her hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last year. Now, there's nothing personal in this for me relative to this individual. I have not met her. I'm sure she's a woman of good character, perhaps qualified for the job, but nevertheless, it's important, I think, that we understand before we take this vote what we're doing here and why we shouldn't be doing it, and that Ms. Nix-Hines has been central to advancing her nomination into confirmation to this organization. If confirmed, this nomination will result in the fact that the administration is sending a representative to an organization that we do not fund and in which we have no vote. That's right. We will be sending a confirmed U.S. ambassador to an organization which we do not support and in which we have no vote. That contradiction can only mean that the administration is still attempting to change those circumstances by seeking waiver authority. And that is the reason why I'm speaking today and why I oppose this nomination. Let me give a little history here. In late 2011, UNESCO offered membership to the Palestinian Authority. This was a consequence of the Palestinian campaign to achieve recognition as a state by appealing unilaterally and directly to the United Nations and its agencies. UNESCO's decision to admit Palestine as a full member has further dimmed prospects for a negotiated peace in the Middle East. My fear is that this step, which the Palestinians mistakenly regard as a success, will encourage them to press for membership in other UN bodies as well, achieving legitimacy through the UN that they don't deserve as a state and that they need to understand presents major obstacles to ever achieving some type of reconciliation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This will harm Israel. It'll harm the Palestinians' own interest, harm the UN agencies involved, and damage our own national interest. To prevent just this sort of unilateral maneuver by the Palestinians, U.S. law, it's in the law, has long prohibited funding to any UN agency that admits Palestine as a member. The purpose of this termination and the will of Congress regarding it was to discourage such reckless behavior by the UN and by the Palestinians. Let me repeat that. The harm that is done through this has brought us to the point where we passed a law signed by the President that said we will not support any agency that acknowledges and admits Palestine as a recognized state. That is not our policy. It's so funding UNESCO or even providing a waiver for that would be a clear violation of U.S. law. Now, we have seen the administration try to work around Congress in a number of ways, neglecting to check the law in terms of what they are required to do. We're currently in an embroiled situation here through this detainee release from Guantanamo of 5 of the top leaders of the Taliban, blatant violation of the law that exists in the books in terms of consultation with Congress before this is done. Nevertheless, that's not what I'm here for today. That's another issue. Our laws require the United States to cut off budget support to UNESCO, and we'll do the same to other agencies that also circumvent the correct path to a negotiated settlement. I think that's good policy. when some administration officials spoke publicly soon after the UNESCO vote about finding a, quote, workaround or seeking a waiver, I introduced legislation not to tolerate such alternatives and said I would not support a waiver. I repeated those efforts in subsequent state and foreign operations appropriations bills when the administration included appropriations for UNESCO in its budget request. And Secretary Kerry said in his testimony that they would be, quote, seeking to change or repeal the law. In his comments on the subject, Secretary Kerry spoke about the value he saw in this UN agency, but said nothing about the value of discouraging Palestinian efforts to circumvent negotiations and change its status at the UN before there's an agreed settlement. Similarly, Ms. Nix-Hines' statement for the Foreign Relations Committee, she spoke forcefully about her views on UNESCO and its importance to U.S. interests. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But nevertheless, she said nothing about how the Palestinian end run at the United Nations harmed our quest for a Middle East settlement. She repeated the administration's intention to seek a waiver of existing law to resume contributions to UNESCO, declaring that, and I quote her, "We are not a country that turns tail when decisions do not go our way. We are not a people who shrink from challenge." Well, that's true, we're not. But in stating that, she has equated a principled stance on this important issue, a stance that she does not agree with, as an act of cowardice. It's an act of law. It's an act that was enacted by this body with support from the House of Representatives and signed by the President of the United States. So her statement makes no sense unless you come to the conclusion she was handed talking points, as other members of the administration have been handed, and said, go ahead and go down and say this if this question comes up. Don't worry about the facts. Now, I can understand why a nominee to UNESCO would want to restore U.S. funding to the organization and thus restore the U.S. vote there. But to purposely ignore or misconstrue the opposing view once stated in U.S. law and supported by this Congress for 20 years, and then to go on and imply that such a view is cowardly, that's offensive. That's offensive to those members of us who have supported this law, who enacted this law. It's offensive to the President who signed this law. It's offensive to the American people who sent us here to pass laws and to enforce those laws as passed. And to call that action cowardly is something that's offensive as well. The laws that are designed to discourage UN bodies from admitting Palestinian Authority before a comprehensive settlement are essential if negotiations are to have any chance at all. Far from being anachronistic, as some connected with UNESCO are claiming, they are more current and important now than ever. It's now that the Palestinians are trying to change their status at the UN unilaterally, and it is now we must use the available tools to prevent it. If we were to grant waiver authority to the administration, as they have requested, the floodgates would open. The existence of waiver authority, not to mention the actual exercise of a waiver, would embolden the Palestinians to make even greater unilateral efforts to achieve membership in UN bodies. And the result would present repeated funding dilemmas for us and would make a true negotiated peace that much more difficult to achieve. The nomination of a candidate for the UNESCO position at least gives me this opportunity to restate clearly and unambiguously, once again, that I remain firmly opposed to providing funds to UNESCO or any other UN agency that repeats this serious error. And I hope my colleagues would understand this and support it also. Thus, I cannot support funding UNESCO while Palestine is a member, and nor will I support a waiver of existing restrictions, and I don't think anyone else should either, because it violates U.S. law. To repeat, this nomination means the administration wants to send a representative to an organization that we do not fund and in which we have no vote. That contradiction can only mean that the administration still wants to change those circumstances by seeking waiver authority, and therefore I will oppose this nomination and hope my colleagues will support the same. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.